Hi, everybody. We can adjust. Flexibility is the name of the game. All right, so we are in the second week of Advent. Our theme is peace. And I'm going to be really honest with you. This is always the Advent theme that I struggle with the most. And I'm going to share with you why as we have this conversation this morning. But this is always the second week of Advent. Man, I have to wrestle with this theme every single year. So before I share that with you, let me give a couple of disclaimers this morning. You know, progressive Christianity, which typically the disciples of Christ are often thought to be, we at Inglewood definitely fall under progressive Christianity. Oftentimes, progressive Christianity gets accused of being too political. And I'm going to argue for this morning's sake that everything about the Christmas story is political. And it's important that we understand that context. Because when we take things out of context, we lose a lot of the meaning. We lose a lot of the perspective. I had a theology professor, a hermeneutics professor, that said, when you take words away from their friends, you change their meaning. When we take stories out of their context, we drastically change the storyline. And so it's really important that we understand that everything about this nativity story was a political story. Everything that happened. We cannot fully understand the meaning and the nuance of this beloved narrative unless we understand and we accept that fact. Much like we, as followers of Jesus today, we also have to recognize that we too live in political context. And we cannot divorce our faith and our beliefs from the circumstances and the context of our day. We have to try to figure out how we wrestle with what we are taught in Scripture, what we are called to be in the world, and how do we live that out in a context that is often political. And this week's theme provides us that tension and that opportunity to wrestle with that division. The other thing that I need to acknowledge in this week's story, in the scripture that Sandy just read for us, talks about probably one of the most highly debated pieces of the Gospel of Luke, and that is the timeline that is often lifted up around the census, right? Many Bible scholars will say, wait a second, this doesn't add up. This call for people to return to their homeland doesn't add up to when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And there's a lot of difficulty around that, especially because Luke was really a stickler for details. And so it's important for me to name that because in many spaces, we don't question, we just accept. But here, I think it's really important that we often say it's okay to wrestle with some of those inconsistencies. It's okay to ask, wait a second, does that add up perfectly? And what does that mean for this story? And so I name that and I highlight that because it's okay for us to acknowledge that there's some question and some tension around that timeline. But as we dig into this story and we look at this census that called them, this political call, this political mandate that called Mary and Joseph to have to relocate in the 9th month of her pregnancy, it's important for us to realize just how political that was, right? This census that is being called for had a lot of purposes. One of those purposes was taxation, right? Making sure that we knew exactly how many people there were so that we knew exactly how much we could tax them. And oftentimes those taxes disproportionately impacted those that were in poverty. They oftentimes disproportionately impacted the Jewish people. But there was another political motivation for this census, and that was being able to keep track of the growing Jewish population, making sure that we could keep this group of people where there were some political tensions with them in their teachings and their belief that this coming king would be coming, that we could kind of keep them in check and keep an eye on some things. So there was some definite political motivation for this call. And so I'm gonna stop here for a second and say, if it's uncomfortable for you, for us to name that several times so far this morning, that this is a political story, I want to argue and I want to assess for you that perhaps you, like me, for a long time, I think I became very bought in to the Hallmark version of Christmas in Christianity. This beautiful, sweet, watercolor Thomas Kinkade painting picture of Silent Night and all the beautiful, and it makes us feel so good, right? I mean, come on. I love a good Hallmark movie as much as the next person. But I do think that this feeling that we have developed over the generations, that Christmas is just beautiful and warm and fuzzy, does a disservice to this story. Because I would argue that the first Christmas probably was not the plot line of a Hallmark movie. The first Christmas was probably not warm and fuzzy and feel good. In fact, there were very few things that felt peaceful about that first Christmas. Many of us have probably had to change some of our theological thinking and perspectives and beliefs over our lifetime. There's a term for that. Some of you may be more familiar with it than others. It's called deconstructing, right? We learned this one way, but as we started to explore and ask questions of Scripture and of the text, and we started to look at things, we started to say, man, I don't know if the way I was taught is exactly what that's trying to say. And for a lot of us, there's easy places for us to start deconstructing. But I think the last place that many of us apply deconstruction is to the Christmas story. I was reading a book recently. The book is called Complicated Pregnancy, and it was a theological look at Mary's pregnancy. And in the introduction to this book, the author says this: my friends asked me what I was writing about, and I told them, and they said, oh, you don't mess with the Christmas story. Nobody wants to question the Christmas story. You don't deconstruct the Christmas story. And he said, but yet I've written a whole book about it, so here we go. And it was a really challenging book, incredibly challenging. But here's the point. So often, we want Christmas to make us feel peaceful. And because we want to feel peace this time of the year, we project that desire for peace into a narrative where honestly peace is not always there. I mean, if we really look at this first Christmas story, we really look at Mary and Joseph, we're talking about a young teenager. In that culture, most likely, Mary was between the ages of 15 and 17. She is married to an older man. They are forced at the very end of her pregnancy to go long distance. They do not have a comfortable car or means of travel. Most likely, Mary is riding a donkey. For those of you who have had the privilege of carrying a child, can you imagine riding a donkey across the desert in your 9th month of pregnancy? Can you imagine the fear that must have stirred up in her? And that journey, that was not just a guarantee of safety, right? Like, this was not just a sightseeing adventure. This was a dangerous road that they were called to travel. This was a road that was fraught with people that would attack travelers frequently. We know that from history. There's documentation that those kind of things would happen often. And Joseph is trying to make sure that he's got this donkey as loaded as possible with everything they could possibly need. But I'm sure there were so many questions. There were so many worries. There were so many anxieties. There was pain, physical pain for both of them, I'm sure, right? Joseph is having to lead this donkey. He's having to walk. Mary's having to try to do the best that she can. When I was 7 months pregnant with Bryson, my family moved 3 hours from where we were living at the time. And I had to I had to drive 3 hours in a U-Haul truck that did not have good suspension. And I remember that entire drive that I'm driving into Kansas City, and I was not a big city driver anyway. I was so anxious. And it was one of my very first panic attacks as I was driving. And it wasn't just the traffic. It was everything. Am I going to find a doctor? What's this going to look like? Are we going to be able to do this? Will my mom get there in time? Like anybody relate to that? Once it starts, it just goes, right? And you just spiral. I'm sure that there was a piece of that. If we're naming Mary's humanity, who's going to deliver this baby? Are we going to find a midwife? What if there's other people? What if all the midwives are taken? Who's going to be with me? What's this going to look like? Where's Joseph going to be? Like, I'm sure that there was an element of panic and anxiety for this upcoming birth. Where are we going to stay? Is somebody going to let us in? What's this going to look like? I've never given birth. I don't know what to do. How bad does it really hurt? They say it really hurts. I'm sure that there was not a lot of peace of mind for Mary in that moment. And so if we're really honest, friends, there's not a lot of peace in this first Christmas story, and this is hence my wrestling with the Advent theme of peace. Because often I think we push this peace narrative where we want it to make us feel good. But really, this narrative reminds me of the words of the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 8, Jeremiah declares this. He says, "They have treated the wound of my daughter and my people carelessly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." Jeremiah is saying, people proclaim peace. They're feeling peace. They're trying to say it's peaceful. They're trying to act like it's peaceful, but there's not peace. People are hurting. And I feel like that's a little bit what we do to this story of Mary and Joseph. It's a little bit of what we do to our world today. When we project this picturesque, Hallmark-esque, feel-good narrative, we lose the reality and the context of so much of the struggle. I've been reading a fiction book recently. It's by an author named Jose Saramago. And the book has been around for a long time. It's called The Gospel According to Jesus Christ. Some of you may have read it. It's essentially a fictional account of Jesus' version of what happened. But the opening couple of chapters are a first perspective from Joseph and what it was like to get that command that they were going to have to go to Bethlehem, and what it was like to have to try to figure out how to get there and all the details, and what he felt like as he was trying to wrestle through all of these things. And there's a line that the author writes that it has just stuck with me for years. And he says this. He's describing the crowd, because Mary and Joseph were not the only ones on that road that were traveling back to their birthplace. So there were lots of people traveling. And Saramago says this. He says, if you were to look at that road and that crowd, and you were to try to look for Joseph and Mary, you would find Joseph and Mary everywhere. What he's saying is there was really nothing special about this couple, that if you looked at this whole crowd, that you would know those two, man, there's something amazing and fantastic and sacred and beautiful and holy going on with those two. They looked like any other traveler in the crowd. The idea is that Mary and Joseph, they represented the common human experience. They were having a family. They were living in poverty. They were dealing with political tensions. They were being forced to be displaced from their place that they were living in, had built community, back to Joseph's birthplace. They looked like anyone else on that road today, that day. And here's what I can't stop thinking about this week. The same is true for us today. There are Mary and Josephs all around us. All around us. There's a phenomenal song that came out back in the early, mid-90s, I'm not sure. But it comes out and it talks about what if Jesus was born today. And it describes all these different contexts in which we might encounter Jesus today. And would we see him? Would we pay attention to him? Would we recognize him? Would we recognize a modern day Mary and Joseph? Because modern day Mary and Josephs are all around us. They're on the cover of your bulletin today. This image from the artist Kelly Lattimore. We bought her series this year so that every week we can feature a different depiction of the holy couple to fit our theme of Welcome the Stranger. This modern day Mary and Joseph. 4 years ago, it was Christmas season and I was at home, and I had been doing a lot of outreach in the cold, getting ready for Christmas and checking on different people. And at that time, we were doing a lot of medical outreach. And so we had a list that we made rounds to different tents during the week. And I had medical volunteers that would come with me. And one that was always on my mind was an 8.5-month pregnant woman in a camp in the snow with her partner. And my phone rang late one night and said, she's had her baby. The ambulance is here. CPS is going to take the baby. They're clearing the camp tonight because that's what would happen. They could kind of go under the radar until an emergency call was made. And I thought, man, what if that was Mary and Joseph? What does that look like? I gave you our advocacy Advent calendars last week, and one of those tasks was to watch some documentaries. I spent this week watching the Netflix series Living Undocumented, which was one of the ones that was on our list. There's 6 episodes in that series. Every single one of those people, I kept thinking, modern day Mary and Joseph's. Most of them were parents trying to figure out how to take care of kiddos, or kiddos who had come into this country because parents were trying to figure out what to do. I think of my good friend Alex, who is currently back in Mexico. Alex had a pending case before immigration as the victim of a violent crime, which makes you a special case for a special kind of immigration protection. He had tried to leave a gang that he had gotten into to provide for his family. When he tried to leave that gang, he was jumped and his eye was gouged out. He got on a bus and he came to Missouri from California. He showed up at our medical outreach. He hadn't had surgery to take care of it. It was horribly infected. We were able to not only get him the procedure he needed, but then he stayed in one of our respite houses for over a year. He was already pretty fluent in English, but he improved his English. He got a job. He was working nonstop. He was volunteering nonstop. You needed something, Alex was your person. When I moved out here, I kept track of Alex's story through several of my friends and through him. Alex's boss, who didn't have documentation, was detained and had 2 little kids that were toddlers. Guess who took those 2 little kids? My friend Alex. And he was doing his best to take care of them and work and get them to school and do everything else, until one day he was speeding 2 miles over a speeding limit inside of a small rural community. He was picked up, he was detained, and he was deported within 15 days. Modern day Marys and Josephs are all around us. I have the privilege of working with the Yakima Immigrant Response Network, and some of the stories that we're hearing, some of the stories that we're providing Christmas gifts for right now, unbelievably heartbreaking. A hardworking dad who was trying to do his best to take care of his family was picked up at the gas station. We're buying Christmas gifts for his family. A father and a grandfather who was detained in his front yard after being in this country for 27 years. We're buying gifts for his grandchildren. A young father in his 20s who was detained at a regular check-in, trying to follow all the rules and go by all the things. These, my friends, are modern day Mary and Josephs. These are the things that are happening all around us. This is the context of our Christmas this year. So when I say that we can't separate our celebration from our context, no more than we can separate out the story of Mary and Joseph from the context in which it occurred, it's crucial that we see that connection. You know, there's a modern day chant that we often hear at social justice rallies, and people will often say, no justice, no peace, which is just a modern day version of Jeremiah saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. We, my friends, we are called to be people of peace. We don't celebrate Christmas because it was peaceful. We celebrate Christmas because Jesus, the Prince of Peace, as he was called by the prophets, was born into this world to work for peace, to try to fix broken systems, to speak truth to power, to try to set things right. And then in his very first Sermon on the Mount, he gives us the Beatitudes, where he's essentially telling us what we're supposed to be doing. Blessed are those who work for peace. Ultimately, we celebrate this season because of the birth of an immigrant baby to a displaced couple who grew up to challenge the systems and the structures of that day, and to call us to make peace and love and mercy the legacy of following him. May we never lose sight that that is our call as followers of Jesus. For years, I've wrestled with this theme of peace in the Advent season. And I've made some peace with it because I've realized it's probably our most inverted Advent theme. It's really this time that peace doesn't make it into the Advent wreath, into our narrative, because it was peaceful. Peace makes it into the Advent theme because peace is ultimately the legacy of Advent. Peace was the work of Jesus. Peace is the call to us. Jesus who came to challenge, to teach, to love. We take that work on as followers of Jesus. We make peace by not ignoring suffering, by not ignoring headlines, by not ignoring the stories of individuals when we have the opportunity to learn their names and their situations so that they're not just numbers and statistics anymore. We make peace by not performing peace, by acknowledging that there's hurt and struggle and difficulty all around us. We make peace when we get involved and we help our neighbors. We make peace when we advocate on behalf of other people. My prayer every single day is, may we find peace. May we find peace in our community, in our country, in this world. And I recognize that for that prayer to become a reality, that requires me to work for peace every day. That requires you to work for peace every day. That requires us to work for peace every day. We're going to grab our hymnals and we're going to sing hymn number 677, and we're going to sing it as a prayer this morning. This hymn says, "Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me." My hope and my challenge to you is that we have our sense of peace a little disrupted this morning, that we acknowledge and we embrace that tension that maybe we feel with this conversation this morning. And we recognize that our context is not peaceful and Hallmark-esque. Our context is struggle, and we have work to do, friends. And that is part of the call and the work of Christmas and Advent. We're going to sing this through